Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Lea Beiermann will defend the academic thesis, A Cooperation of Observers, Crafting Knowledge Infrastructures for Microscopy. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Dear Pro-Rector, dear members of the Assessment Committee and supervisors, dear family, friends and colleagues, I'm very happy to be here today, as you can imagine, and very happy that you're all here today with me. I'll take the next 15 minutes or so to give you an idea of the main argument of my PhD dissertation, A Cooperation of Observers, Crafting Knowledge Infrastructures for Microscopy. Pro-Rector mentioned the title, but I hear that it bears repeating. It's quite long. Imagine the following. You've just moved into a new apartment. You've bought some new Swedish-sounding furniture, a bookshelf that still needs to be assembled. It was cheap for a reason. But you feel up to the task. You get your little hammer and screwdriver. You have a very close look at the manual and get working. Soon, however, problems arise. The screws don't really seem to fit, and now that you think about it, they don't really look anything like the ones pictured in the manual. So you start to wonder, is it even the right manual? Or does it maybe belong to another similar bookshelf? And how are you supposed to attach the backboard? How can you lift this bookshelf off the ground, turn it around without damaging it? I'm sure you get the picture. We've all been there. Now, assembling flat-pack furniture may sound like a very 21st or 20th century problem. But the bigger issue here is that sometimes a written manual, a list of step-by-step instructions, isn't enough. It doesn't really tell you all you need to know, like how to lift a bookshelf. And that's a very common problem when you want to get something done that requires your hands and some very practical knowledge, like assembling furniture, or think of maybe knitting, dancing, maybe playing an instrument. If you want to acquire a skill like that, then a list of instructions will often not be enough. Or in other words, it's quite unlikely that you'll win the Great British Bake Off just by reading recipes. In my dissertation, I study a group of people who about 150 years ago grappled with a somewhat similar problem. These people wanted to learn how to use the microscope. And they realized that this was quite difficult to do without personal instruction. In the late 19th century, microscopy became a very common scientific method. But not everyone interested in microscopy lived near someone else, some more experienced user, who could have taught them how to use the instrument. And women were sometimes not even allowed to attend society meetings, microscopy society meetings, where they would have got some personal instruction. But learning microscopy at home from books was a very challenging task. In 1887, the president of the British Postal Microscopical Society, I'll explain what these postal societies are in a minute, this president, J.W. Measures, declared that the beginner is unable to learn from the books on the microscope all the minutiae, the details, of so fine an art as mounting microscope specimens. So what he's saying is the slides that you can see behind me, they're very difficult to make, especially when you're relying on books alone. In my PhD research, I wanted to find out how people still manage to acquire skills in microscopy, people who hardly ever met in person, how they still manage to do that. Acquiring skills that ranged from the making of observations and preparations, and also the production of scientific instruments. And because skills seem so difficult to translate into text, historians have often tended to think that learning skills from other scientific practitioners requires people to be on site, to be co-present in the same room. The historian Miles Jackson, for example, writes that skills are acquired through direct contact and personal observation of experimental technique. And only more recently have historians, and I would say mostly early modernists, have begun to question that kind of assumption that acquiring skills requires people to be co-present in the same room. And my dissertation contributes to that discussion by looking at the sharing of skills in the history of microscopy. A central claim in my research is that in order to learn microscopy from others at a distance or remotely, if you will, microscopists relied on trade and communication infrastructures that allowed for the sharing of skills. Skills may be difficult to translate into writing, but when we consider late 19th century infrastructures in all their diversity, including, for example, slide boxes like the one you see behind me, that was used to circulate slides through the post, or new printing presses that I'll talk about later, then we see that these infrastructures made it possible to share skills to some extent. In the rest of this presentation, I'll tell you just 2 short stories from 2 chapters of my dissertation to illustrate what I mean when I say infrastructures that allowed for the sharing of skills. Before I conclude then with some thoughts on skill, remote learning, and perhaps furniture assembly. In 1878, a man called Thomas Bolton sensed a business opportunity. He was living in Birmingham at the time. He was a passionate microscopist, and he realized that he was not the only one. There were more and more people with an interest in microscopy, and Thomas Bolton had an idea. He set up a subscription service, providing his subscribers, people interested in microscopy, with living microscopic plants and animals in glass tubes, together with instructions on how to observe them. And the British postal system was really vital in sending subscribers those living plants and animals. And a new kind of printing press also that could be set up and used at home, and that Bolton had, and that made it possible for him to print and distribute written instructions and images alongside these little glass tubes. Bolton worked together with illustrators and later also a scribe, who would often copy texts and images published elsewhere and then redistribute them among Bolton's subscribers. And this made it possible for subscribers to not rake their own garden pond in search of an animal or a microscopic plant, but get these animals delivered to their front door, basically. And also instructions to go with them to tell them what to look for in the specimen. So the combination of Bolton's at-home printing press and the swift distribution of specimens through the post made it possible to provide instructions for observation together with the object of observation, helping beginners in microscopy to learn how to identify microorganisms. In my dissertation, I followed the illustrations circulated by Bolton and others with the help of a digital citizen science project, Worlds of Wonder, that I organized as part of my PhD. And I noticed that with the help of this project, I noticed that in this process of learning to make observations through the microscope in the late 19th century, copying illustrations by hand was a very important technique. By copying illustrations by hand, microscopists honed their observational skills. They learned what to look for in a specimen. So I would say that the circulation of copied illustrations was not just a side effect of cheap printing technologies, but it was really an integral part of microscopists' observational practice. And commercial specimen dealers like Bolton played a very significant role in making those illustrations available. Moving from Birmingham, England, to the US, another of my chapters traces an exchange of microscope slides organized by the American Postal Microscopical Club. And this club built postal circuits that enabled members to pass on slides and notebooks following a chain letter system. The club's aim was to educate its members on how to make permanent slides. The members soon realized that this was also quite difficult to do without meeting in person. But they conceived of alternative ways of sharing their skills. By circulating not only letters, but also slides through the post, microscopists could compare instructions with their execution. They could compare their own slides with someone else's, and also reverse engineer what they considered failed preparations. And they would let people know that they had failed them and how. But this postal network was quite fragile. It really depended to a large extent on members being very reliable. So they could not just forget to forward packages. That would derail the whole system. And the club also had to make sure that not too many of the slides would break in transit. And in order to deal with these vulnerabilities, the club published regular reports on its activities in Microscopy magazines. Many of these reports were authored by Mary Ann Booth, a prolific commercial slide maker. And these reports helped to keep track of the slides. They made it possible to see where they were at a certain moment in time, centralize the postal exchange, also discipline unreliable members who would then be scolded in the pages of the magazine. These reports also made it possible to share recommendations for preparation, of course. And Mary Ann Booth also suggested to include with each box the date when placed in circulation, affording, she wrote, to some extent, a test of the comparative durability of the various modes of preparation. And this suggestion was taken up, and the circulation of slides became a sort of long-term experiment in a way, to test the durability of slides. And it helped set the benchmark for what was considered a good slide. A good slide was one that could survive 2 years of postal exchange. So a club member's skill in making slides became quite inseparable from their skill in using the club's postal infrastructure. So those were my two stories, two examples of how trade and communication infrastructures facilitated the sharing of skills in the late 19th century. But what do we make of them now? I'd like to conclude with just two thoughts on how the history of microscopy, I tell in my dissertation, might still be relevant today. My first thought concerns participatory research projects or citizen science projects. I only really managed to follow Bolton's illustrations and others' illustrations with the help of Worlds of Wonder, the citizen science project I organized. And in my dissertation, I make a case for considering citizen science projects as not just places of data collection, but also places of learning. And I think that history of microscopy can help us reimagine those citizen science projects, for example, by reminding us to conceive of citizen scientists as skillful, inquisitive learners who not only use but also innovate technology in the process of a project. And this means that we should, of course, design the digital infrastructures of the citizen science platforms to make room for experimentation and learning. And my final thought is this. I now work for a company that supports employees in acquiring digital skills, very often remotely. I think that remote work and learning are here to stay. And this means that we have to think very hard about how we want to teach skills remotely. In a work meeting last year, I gave a short presentation about my PhD research, and my new colleagues and I talked about what we might learn from it. We did also talk about the best way of assembling Swedish furniture, and my colleagues had some hilarious ideas about that. After the meeting, we compiled a list of 4 tips for remote learning and furniture assembly. 1, make someone else's instructions your own. Instead of just passively reading a manual or watching a how-to video, grab a pen and paper and make your own plan. Even just copying a step-by-step manual can help you understand the instructions better and make them your own. 2, connect the new and old. If you want to teach someone a new skill, find out what they already know how to do. Maybe the new dance you want to teach them is a bit like the jump rope game they played in school. If you know what they know how to do, then you can better explain what the new skill requires them to do. 3, recreate failure. We tend to look for best practices to emulate, but we can also learn a lot from failure. And by consciously recreating someone else's failure, we can maybe learn to avoid it. 4, be innovative. That's easier said than done, but we put it this way, colleagues and I. Don't be afraid to diverge from someone else's instructions and do things differently. Sometimes innovations are born out of using objects differently than intended. So it seems that you can draw some very practical, maybe simplistic, but very practical advice from my dissertation. And I hope that you'll all find something useful in it too. Thank you for listening, and I now hand the word back to the pro-rector.
Thank you for your presentation. The opposition will be opened by the chair of the assessment committee, Professor Karen Bijsterveld, Professor of Science, Technology and Modern Culture.
Thank you. Dear PhD candidate, dear Lea, congratulations with your wonderful thesis. It's strong in its originality, its focus on remote sharing of practical knowledge, and in its clarity, theoretical sophistication, and embedding in the scholarly literature. And your elegant style of writing also makes the book a great read and helped to transport me to a time period in which the postal services, one of the infrastructures under study, were still excellent. And this triggered some nostalgia in me, being someone who stubbornly keeps posting handwritten letters. Now, my question is this. I find your argument about how those involved in microscopy shared practical knowledge convincing. You show how these people, on top of making infrastructures work for them, used figurative language, visual analogies, and illustrations with instructions to share hard-to-convey practical knowledge. Now, these strategies are very similar to the ones employed by, for instance, medical doctors in sharing sensory skills. Think of listening to the stethoscope across distance, as you may know from the work by your colleagues or former colleagues Jens Lackmund and Anna Harris. That said, how different is sharing those skills remotely and in person? Even in situations in which doctors and many other experts relying on embodied instruction can demonstrate such skills in person, they use metaphors and drawings on the spot. Put differently, even if your focus on remote sharing is original, how specific are your conclusions? And this question is also relevant because you claim yourself that some of the published illustrations, given that these would be copied, adapted, and republished, were hardly less mutable than the initial drawing. So also there, in a different way, you seem to question the specificity of remote sharing. So that's my question. So how specific are your conclusions?
Okay, yeah, thank you, highly esteemed opponent.
So compared to in person.
Okay, yeah, so if I understand you correctly, you're saying that some of these methods that I observe might also be used in in-person meetings, maybe. So, like, I can imagine that, for example, a lecturer, a traveling lecturer, would use figurative language also to convey how to observe a specimen. That's true. So I have to think about that for a moment. Yeah, I think all I can say that, of course, this is just probably also just one way that people would have learned about microscopy, right? So it's not that I look at people whose only source of information was the letters they received, for example. So there were many who would also attend society meetings where, they might have experienced similar ways of teaching microscopy. I think they are very interconnected. That's true.
Thank you for the moment.
The opposition will be continued by Professor Nassim, who's a professor of history of science at the University of Regensburg.
Dear PhD candidate, thank you very much for a polished, well-written thesis, which was a pleasure to read. They're not always a pleasure, but this was one. I also like to thank you for, bringing to the fore the microscope back into the history of science, but specifically back into the history of observation. This was refreshing and much needed, and thank you. So as to my questions, it's more of an invitation to think aloud with me about some issues specifically related to your notion of scientific observation. Now, this is specifically catered, your dissertation is catered to that notion all throughout. And whenever you do talk about observation of all sorts, you bring it back to bear on what's referred to as scientific observation with that adjective. I just want to push in the direction of the following, and that is, ostensibly, in the literature, historians of science have dealt with scientific observation in a very specific and narrow way, because the idea is that precisely because it is very specific and narrow. What your dissertation does is it seems to include within that category a much broader, much more democratic ways of observing that include entertainment, public observations, observations meant for teaching, pedagogy, education, but also observations meant that arise from actually copying by printers. You have observations that are middle class, that are working class, that are even aristocratic. You have observations that are from children and also from ladies of all classes. So your treatment of observation is very heterogeneous in many ways. And not just observations as such, but who's doing the observing is also varies. All the way from printers actually doing the illustrations or actually doing the engraving are included under the category of observation. So my question is, how do you pair that very broad, very heterogeneous description of observation, which you treat very, very democratically, with a much more narrow category of scientific observation under which all these are supposed to fit?
Yeah, thank you, highly esteemed opponent, for this question. This is something I've been thinking about for a while. I think I'm not the only one to adopt a very broad notion of observation, right? So I think I'm with Elizabeth Lundbeck and Lorraine Daston, who I think in their history of observation say that observation as a scientific method also has always straddled the boundary between art and science. And I think if you want to capture that range of sources also that are used in scientific observation that can be entertaining, then I think we also have to adopt a very broad notion of observation in our analyses. So I think that's what I would say. And I think Karen Nicholson also wrote about how in the 18th century draftsmen observed other pictures and illustrations, and that this was really very much part of their scientific observational practice too, that it was more of a multimedia kind of practice. So I think we should also include the observation of illustrations in the practice of scientific observation. If that answers your question.
So maybe just a short follow-up then. I mean, then you're basically suggesting we broaden the category broader than what we might expect it to be. So the question that becomes, why not just exclude the idea of scientific there and treat observation as such?
Well, I think you've already said it, because I agree with you that there's a danger of flattening out hierarchies, and maybe I'm guilty of that to some extent, also because I think I followed images, and I think this methodology kind of invites, in a way, a flattening out of hierarchies. But maybe it's useful to keep the category of scientific observation to make clear that, of course, also at the time, some observation practices were considered more scientific than others, right? And that can still it can still capture the hierarchies that existed, and I didn't mean to flatten out, but maybe I did in some instances.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Belknap, Keeper of Science and Technology, the National Museums of Scotland.
Dear PhD candidate, dear Lea, thank you for inviting me to join in this conversation with you. It was a delightful PhD to read, well-structured, well-argued, and it's a privilege here to join this conversation around the work that you have presented to us. It's also great to see the evolution of your thinking over time, I think, based on some of the experiences of your master's degree coming through to this PhD. And I'm particularly interested, so my question circles around citizen science. What do you think are the methodological potential of utilizing a citizen science approach to exploring amateur community practice in the 19th century? And I'm particularly interested in exploring with you whether or not you think this is an approach that's specific to parallel communities of practice. So there's a really nice resonance between the communities that you developed and built through the Zooniverse project and the communities you're exploring in the 19th century. So what I would like to think through is that the limit of this methodology? Do we need to look to parallel communities of practice in order to utilize citizen science methodology? Or is there a larger question? Can it be used in much broader historical contexts in sometimes oppositional community practice or oppositional practice from the 19th century? And I'd like to also mention, as I'm saying this, it's great to see that you've actually developed a whole citizen science project as a methodology for your PhD. So congratulations on that.
Thank you, esteemed opponent. I was very much inspired, of course, by the project that I could be part of a few years ago in Leicester. I really enjoyed that. That's a good question. But yeah, it also makes me wonder, I'm a bit surprised that you say that this might be the limit of looking at historical communities and present-day communities that have parallels in a way. Because I felt during my research that I was kind of crossing boundaries already, because constantly historians would tell me, this is anachronistic, this is presentist, you cannot compare 19th century communities to this citizen science community. So this is something I struggled with, and also I think why in my dissertation the whole project is more of an afterthought maybe, because I never quite knew how to incorporate it in the dissertation so that historians would be wouldn't mind reading that chapter. Yeah, I feel like I've already broadened, in a way, the horizon of maybe people who are not familiar with these kinds of methods by using it in my research. So yeah, this is a challenging question, because I feel like I was already crossing boundaries with what I did. But maybe I can imagine that this would also be useful for other projects. I mean, there are very successful projects where people read letters, for example, or transcribe letters, and those are quite different communities, the historical community and the present-day community. But that often present-day people are then drawn to it because they learn about their family, for example. And that has a lot of value, I think, and I'm always amazed by these projects, and I can imagine that there are more projects like that. That might be worth exploring.
Thank you.
The opposition will be continued by Professor Emily Sitzia, Chair of the Fiep Westendorp Foundation Special Chair in Illustration at the University of Amsterdam, but also working here at Maastricht University.
Dear PhD candidate, thank you for a well-written, original, and engaging thesis that contributes to various fields of research, connecting them in an efficient and elegant manner. I was particularly intrigued by your Worlds of Wonder citizen science project, and I would like you to expand on the connection that you see between citizen science projects in the 21st century and 19th century collaborations.
Thank you. Highly esteemed opponent. Yeah, as I said, there's always a risk of drawing parallels like that, right? Yeah, I mean, the case I made in my research also to, get the funding for that research was that, we can see parallels that, at least at the kind of the mid-19th century, there was still, the boundary between experts and amateurs was not as clear-cut as it might be today. Although today, that this might be the parallel, maybe this boundary is becoming more malleable again. For example, another very well-known example is that, very well-known parallel is that these periodicals that people had available, scientific periodicals, were quite, heterogeneous and also, in a way, maybe similar to digital platforms in the sense that there were correspondence columns where people would come together and chat and even shout at other people using capitalized letters, what we see today in chat forums. So if you want me to draw parallels, this is possible. This might be one example. And also today, I think some companies are are trying some kind of co-production innovation processes. This is also happening, and you might draw a parallel there to how Ernst Abbe worked together with the microscopists in England, also quite successfully. And I can imagine that it would be worthwhile for companies to try to recreate collaborations like that, definitely.
Thank you.
The opposition will be continued by Dr. Jo Wachelder, Associate Professor in the Cultural History of Science here at Maastricht University.
Thank you, Prorector. Dear candidate, dear Lea, I would like to join my colleagues in congratulating you with this interesting thesis. It's a very good read. It testifies of your ambitions as a writer. It is original, both the selection of the main subject, amateurs of microscopy in the second part of the 19th century, and the wide variety of literature digested, which is combined into an overall argument. You managed to connect an interest in craft in microscopy with a theoretical focus on infrastructures and a methodological triple to analyze these infrastructures in 3 case studies. Within this compelling structure, you allowed yourself interesting detours, seamlessly harnessing many STS concepts for your historical narrative. If I had to summarize your thesis in one word, it would be amazing. And I use this word because it also introduces my critical questions. In the acknowledgements, you refer to your many previous ambitions. Next to a writer, you wanted to become, and now I quote, you wanted to become an inventor, a detective, a physicist, a microbiologist, an archaeologist. And I wonder whether you have considered becoming a magician, a conjurer. Having arrived at chapter 5, having digested 3 convincing case studies, you start bringing it all together. And there, a different amazement popped up. When you explained the historical development from the 1860s to the 1990s, I felt I was watching a conjurer's act, whereas the 3 colored balls in the magician's left hand moved without witnessing to the right hand, while changing color. That's not to deny that the factor of amortization, which you highlighted for the rise of interest in microscopy in the 1860s was not relevant, or that the commercialization which should contribute to its decrease of amateur microscopical communities in the 1890s did not play a role. Yet what particularly surprised me that these factors seem to be rather external to the infrastructure. Commerce was already flourishing in the 1860s, whereas spending leisure time and had started before and engaging in hobbies and even serious hobbies took off in the 1860s as well. And as a question, I would like you to reflect on the potential, but also on the limitations of focusing on infrastructures to explain major changes in the interests of amateur microscopical societies.
Thank you, esteemed opponent, for the very kind words and your question. Yeah, the concept of infrastructure, it's a difficult concept. I remember talking about this with a colleague about a year ago. And I remember saying, maybe during my defense, someone will ask, what is infrastructure really? And then the whole argument will collapse in a way. But that colleague asked me then, what did that concept of infrastructure, what did that make visible for you? How did it help you write this thesis? And I think it helped me a lot. I think, for example, if I looked at the this postal network as a network rather than as a kind of infrastructure, I might have been more interested in the relationships between people, which would have been interesting as well. But I think this way I was more interested in the post and how slides would break. And yeah, I kind of dug deeper in a way, or I had to look at another kind of aspect. But of course, I mean, using that kind of concept, I certainly probably missed other aspects of the history of microscopy. For example, I think I might have been more interested in movement, for example, also how people really prepared slides and made microscopes, staying with the people rather than always moving from one to the next, which I think this concept of infrastructure maybe also encouraged. So this is something that I may have missed. Yeah, if that answers your question.
Many thanks.
We will continue with Professor Bijsterveld.
Yeah, thank you that we have another chance. We know that you're quite an efficient speaker, and we already hope that there will be more time, so that's great. So I would like to say or ask something in relation to the history of technology and the history of musical instruments, because in that kind of history there has been quite some attention to the role of intermediaries, including shop owners, in translating practical knowledge about new instruments from the manufacturers to customers. And you do refer to shops for, microscopists, also amateurs in the world, in that particular world. So you came across them, and you refer to them in passing. But I wonder whether you could reflect a bit more on the role of such shops, because you can imagine, that these interactions between the shop owners and customers, if customers travel to these shops, may have informed or fed into the remote sharing of knowledge. So it's again about these relations and perhaps also distinctions between personal or in-person and remote knowledge, sharing of knowledge. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, highly esteemed opponent. I like the question because I was a bit sad that I didn't get to write about shop owners. I remember I went to an archive in Philadelphia where they had the diary of a shop owner, and it was someone who had traveled from England to the US, kind of like a grand tour, but the other way around. So traveling the US, coming from Europe, I found that really interesting. Also, what he wrote about the American shops he was setting up. That, for example, he had they had taken over a jeweler's store, and that was very important. That you could, through the big windows, you could not just watch the jewelry, but then after this shop was set up, you could have a look at the great big microscopes through the shop window. So that was certainly also part of drawing people to microscopy, certainly. Manufacturers like Zeiss and also Aber through Zeiss were in touch, of course, with shop owners, and that was quite important. So there was a Scottish shop owner who, he wanted to set up a shop and then got in touch with Zeiss in order to order microscopes from him, but also to exchange information of what kinds of microscopes people might find useful living in that area. So it was a mutually beneficial exchange, probably. And yeah, it's a very interesting aspect of the history of microscopy, but I somehow didn't get to include it in the dissertation.
I now understand, because you focused on remote sharing, but I still hoped you would indeed share a bit more information about these shop owners, and you did, so thank you.
Professor Nassim.
Thank you very much. This sort of follows up on what my colleague has brought up, and I'd just like to, again, invite you to expand, and you've already sort of started answering it, and so I'm going to push you now a little bit on the infrastructure question. And so throughout the dissertation, I kept asking myself, what work is infrastructure doing here that networks are not? And more specifically, the literature around infrastructures usually says something like, well, infrastructures are focused a lot more on the physicality of these networks. But this has also changed recently, even in considering networks as physical things. And it's not simply a one-to-one. Networks can be one, many, 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 and one many. So networks can also act in that way. So instead of just now basically asking you to say a bit more about that, let me just push in another direction with that framework. And that is, in my own experiences, the more one focuses on infrastructures, and I found this also happening between the lines in your dissertation, the more one gets not success stories of achievements of communication actually getting across and crafts knowledge actually getting across. In fact, infrastructures, if they make anything visible, they make failures invisible. Clogs in the infrastructures, problems. So you have the one nice example of breakage of glass, but apart from that, what's not explicit, though it's implicit, are the many actually non-transmitted crafts knowledge that fails to get across these infrastructures precisely because of the infrastructure itself. So those are two prongs there.
Thank you, highly esteemed opponent, for the question. The first thought that comes to mind is that, if I was more of an STS person, I might probably say that, well, a network is an actor network, and then it's much more material than what I was saying earlier, that it's a correspondence network focusing on relationships. Maybe I'm not enough of an STS person to think that way. I'm thinking about what that the infrastructure made visible or not, or what my focus on infrastructure helped me see or not, or other instances of where knowledge was not transmitted, where there were the slides breaking and being crushed. Sometimes, of course, the copying of illustrations did not work as intended. So, for example, I remember that I think, I'm not sure who it was. It was a member of some society who said that the society should rethink its practice of sending specimens or sending illustrations to someone else to be copied. Rather, this person should be supervised by a microscopist on site, because that kind of remote collaboration didn't work. I think if pressed, I would have found more instances probably of failure. And then I think, as I write at the end of the chapter on slide making, on this postal circulation of slides, maybe in many ways this was not the ideal way of transmitting craft knowledge among members of these clubs, but I think some were just happy that there was some way of learning about microscopy and how to make slides, because they did not live close to centers of microscopy. And then this was in a way better than not being able to participate in the sharing of skills in any way. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Dr. Belknap.
So I'm going to ask a probably unsurprising question about illustrations. So I found your chapter on rotifers fascinating, and I think you've convincingly argued to expand the work that myself and Bernard Lightman and others have done. And I find your argument around replication as a form of craft in periodicals and illustration making and the copy and paste argument to be compelling and successfully made. My question, and this is a tough one because it's always tough when you ask a reader a question, which is, how do you have evidence for? Let me back up for a minute. A lot of the evidence that you're focusing on is illustrators and other forms of kind of periodical and illustration makers replicating, remaking that, and I think that's compelling. Do we have examples of readers using these rather than just a feast for the eyes, but as a tool to draw themselves? And if you did, or if you don't, does that change your argumentation in this chapter?
Yeah, thank you, esteemed opponent. It's an interesting, it's a good question. And this is also, something I noticed when I thought about how the chapter is not about movement, for example, in copying illustrations, because I was glad that I was even able to find the publishers copying other illustrations, and it was very difficult to find sources talking about users copying illustrations and how exactly they moved and did that. But I did come across this one source of someone, the son of this Thomas Bolton, who apparently owned a sketchbook. And that's in the archive of the History of Science Museum in Oxford. And that's, it's difficult to tell because there's not much explanatory text or anything, but it seems like this person, this son of Thomas Bolton, copied rotifer illustrations published in a book by Charles Thomas Hudson. And it seems as if, he was trying to make sense of these rotifer illustrations by copying them just as his private practice. And you can tell that they are copied from this book because he uses the same number of figures, and you can kind of match them with the book. Yes, there are some rotifers that appear several times, where you might think that maybe he practiced drawing these rotifers, right? But it's speculation to some extent, of course. But I was very excited to find that kind of source.
Thank you.
Professor Sitzia.
So, back to the Worlds of Wonder. I was wondering if you have any plans to expand your research on Worlds of Wonder and publish about it, because I really think it's a very valuable part of your research, especially in regards to participant use.
Thank you, highly esteemed opponent. This is something I still find interesting myself, certainly. But at the beginning of the project, we decided that I would not collect participant data. Because, one reason was we had to get it through we had to get the approval of the ethics committee quick. But I think I might have thought of a good reason to gather data like that. But also, I think I was so busy running the project that it was very difficult for me to also focus on collecting data, participant data. I think that I would have needed more time or set a different focus also to collect that kind of data and maybe turn that into a paper or something like that. Maybe another time.
Thank you.
Dr. Wachelder.
Many thanks for giving me this opportunity to raise an additional question. I will zero in again on the 1860s, yet now from a different angle and starting in the here and now. In chapter 5, you also reflect on the experience with the Citizen Science Project. And I enjoyed that part as well. And I absolutely value your valuable recommendations, partly based on your experiences, partly based on your historical work. Among others, you recommend to create ample room for citizen scientists to annotate the subject to improve the learning experience on the one hand, and to the benefit of the research project on the other. I think that's very good. It's not using only citizen scientists as labor force, but also giving something back. In the impact paragraph, you refer to Peter Mason, a citizen scientist who kindly offered to write Python scripts for the analysis of the data of the World of Wonder project. And you conclude that reminded you that although citizen scientists may not be professional researchers, they are often experts in other areas. That brings me to the first sentences of your dissertation and to a question which ties in with an observation Karen Bijsterveld and my colleague over here. In which you describe the immense variety of microscopes in the first lines of the dissertation, the immense variety of microscopes and other glasses in the shop of James W. Queen in Philadelphia in 1853. And that actually leads to my question. We already discussed, and this was raised before, that there are also rather implicit skills and knowledge of amateurs, which might be gained from informal or formal education, work, entertainment, and which might be easily overlooked in infrastructures. My question is actually twofold. On the one hand, do you recognize that? And on the other hand, is it also, how do we get access to these more implicit skills? And when I read your dissertation carefully, I also see that to some extent you bring them in. And I was particularly struck by the short biographical intros which you provided when a main actor came in, because then you actually use these 5 or 10 sentences just to introduce some of their background, some of their parents, some of their education, which I feel, and I don't know whether that's actually my question, did you do that deliberately, or did you feel that as something that you would like to add, in a way that you give some background, which might be not easily to read from the focus on infrastructures alone?
Thank you, esteemed opponent. So those are 3 questions, I think, about my use of the concept of infrastructure. The first, I think, is that even by using this concept of infrastructure, it's still difficult to make certain skills visible, right? That's the question. And the second question is also about skills being maybe more implicit and not easily detected, and even using this concept of infrastructure. So maybe I'll answer them in one. I think what I found really useful, but looking back, I think I should have elaborated on that in the dissertation. What I found really useful is Pamela Smith's concept of craft knowledge, which is, I think she published this, it's a chapter she published in an edited volume on, I think it was called The Mindful Hand, and it is about tacit skills. So craft knowledge has a very tacit dimension in Pamela Smith's, in her way of, in her phrasing, in a way. But what I really like about her concept is that she says that to some extent, skill is also embodied in objects. So reading that that paragraph, I always thought it's a bit as if thinking about this old story that often comes up, that I think Michael Polanyi wrote about, learning how to ride a bike, and that this is like the prime example of tacit knowledge that no one can really teach you by way of just explaining with words how to ride a bike. looking at it from this perspective of Pamela Smith's idea of craft knowledge, that made me look at the bike as as a tool, right? That embodies in a way also the knowledge of the bike maker. And this is something that I found very helpful, that I could look at the slides circulated also as as artifacts that embody the knowledge of their makers, and that by analyzing these slides very closely, you can get an idea, or maybe also retrieve some of that craft knowledge if you were someone trying to learn how to make slides. I found that concept very useful of getting at implicit skills or tacit knowledge, if you will. But should have enlarged on that. I think sometimes I have a tendency of gesturing at literature, maybe, and I should have elaborated on that. And I think the last question was about how I introduce people, mentioning their biography in a paragraph or so. I think you could say that this is also. I wouldn't say that this is even the most elegant way of going about it. I think it's also a bit of an unfortunate side effect, maybe, of this focus on infrastructure, and how I remember talking about this with my supervisors also, that I felt like maybe I was too much veering from one thing to the next by following these illustrations in the chapter on Rotifer illustrations. This was my way of introducing all these very different actors as I followed the illustrations, because there were so many of them. Maybe I could have done this more elegantly. I agree with that.
Many thanks.
Professor Westerveld.
Yes, I think we can start asking something about the propositions. And I've one on the last proposition, so number 8. Don't know whether one of the parents would like to read number 8, yeah?
Historians cannot be unpolitical, so they might as well try to be on the right side of history.
Yes, so what is your right side? And how do you know it, that you are on the right side?
Well, I think I said try to be on the right side of history, right? Thank you for that question, highly esteemed opponent. It is something that I felt I should put in the propositions, because I had so many discussions about that during the 4 years of the PhD. This is a bit veering away from the actual dissertation, but I founded this Historians for Future climate group and had lots of discussions with historians about how political historians or activists they can be or may be, or very complicated discussions often. I think I've always liked this. There's an article, I think it's an article by Lorraine Darston on impartiality as an epistemic.
You can finish your sentence.
There's this chapter by Lorraine Darston about impartiality as an epistemic virtue, and I've subscribed to that. It's a bit different from objectivity. It comes from a judicial concept of trying to listen to every party involved, but in the end still judging their action based on some understanding of what is humane action or not. And I think I subscribe to that to some extent. Sorry.
Thank you for explaining.
Lea Beiermann, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
All right.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Southside, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. The line, I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Get the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you've won the battle once you've grown. Southside, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Lea Beiermann, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Modi is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
All right, please.
Okay, last hurdle. Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Lea Beiermann, cum laude, the degree of doctor, and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificates signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university. Okay, now, the very nice part. Congratulations, Lea. I think the only one who had any doubts that we would get to this place was you. Ralph, Stephanie, and I were always sure that you would graduate with flying colors, and indeed, now with the cum laude. As supervisors, our main task was often to assure you that what you'd written was very good, even when you had doubts. We basically never had to steer you away from misinterpretations or rabbit holes or poor writing. Rather, reading your work has always been a pleasure and an opportunity to learn from you. And I'm excited that a much broader audience will now get to experience that pleasure thanks to your new role as a science communicator. Now, you know this backstory, but for our guest today, I should explain that your PhD has a complicated institutional history that began, at least for me, when you were finishing your master's thesis under Ralph's supervision. Ralph came to me and said, in effect, Lea's thesis is very good. She got a cum laude for it. She would be very competitive for an NVO PhD's in the humanities grant. And I said, oh, what's her thesis about? Microscopy? Well, you know, I can't resist the history of microscopy. And in fact, of course, Ralph was right. Your thesis was very good. You were very competitive for the PhDs in humanities competition, so competitive that you eventually won a grant. However, you then told us, well, actually, I'm going to do a PhD in Cologne instead. And in fact, you almost didn't even go for an interview with the NVO. I'm biting my fingernails just thinking about it. But Ralph and I, you know, we aren't so stubborn, we aren't so persuasive, except when it really matters. And we thought, well, this is a case when it really matters. There are lots of people in our faculty who believe in Lea, Karen, Emily, Yo, ourselves, Lise Wesseling, of course, as well, and many others. So we thought, well, we need to convince Lea to stay with us somehow, and we will try to convince her that she could do a double degree with both us and Cologne. In the end, things didn't work out so well in Cologne. Stephanie moved to Heidelberg, so you ended up doing your PhD with us, and I have to say for myself, it's been one of the real lucky breaks of my career. Not just for the chance to supervise this incredible dissertation, but also to work with Ralph and Stephanie. It's been a real pleasure. I know it's been tougher for you, working through COVID, living parallel lives on either side of the border. But you haven't just persevered, you've thrown yourself into not just this dissertation project, but also into the academic community, organizing all sorts of events, and especially connecting academic historians better with engaged citizens and with the grand societal challenges of our time, especially climate change. I'm incredibly impressed with what you've done with the Zooniverse project. I think you've heard from the questions today that all of us are impressed with that. And I'm even more impressed with your involvement with Historians for the Future. I hope beyond hope that those initiatives have the impact that you want them to do. And of course, I'm also very happy that you've already found a job where you can apply your many gifts. So best of luck, Lea, and many congratulations. Now, the PIDEL wants us to keep this brief, but I want everyone to know that I am just the spokesperson for this supervisory team. This is very much a co-equal effort. So let me give the floor briefly to Raf and Stephanie to offer their congratulations.
I'll just say 2 sentences, basically, in order to be very brief. So I'm very, very happy to congratulate you today, Lea, with a thesis that is both very thoughtful and also aesthetically pleasing. I hope you will look back on this achievement with the sense of pride that it deserves. And it was certainly a very great pleasure for me to work with you over the past 5 years. And I wish you many worlds of wonder to explore in the years to come. Stephanie?
Yes, from my side, from a distance, sorry. I can only add that for me too, it was a great pleasure to accompany you, Lea, together with Raf and Cyrus on your journey, to read you and advise you to the best of my abilities, and to watch you craft this utterly well-composed, beautiful, theoretically sophisticated text that your dissertation has become. I've always enjoyed our conversations, have learned a lot from them about things I never knew existed, like rotifers or diatom specimens, or most recently Dutch PhD ceremonies. And so again, I can only join in Cyrus's praise, everyone's praise really, and thank you for letting me be part of that endeavor.
Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, I'd also like to congratulate you with the degree you have acquired. This marks the end of the formal ceremony. I believe there will be photos taken, and I think we would like to ask Stephanie to say, so we can have you present in this as well. But then we will join you all in the Refter for drinks and to celebrate this wonderful achievement. Thank you.
You can relax.
Nice to have the certificate in the pictures.
Nimmst du das noch mit? Oder?